Around many seismic areas, there are nowadays enough seismic stations whose recordings enable a relatively good and rapid determination of basic earthquake parameters. For major earthquakes, the global networks also provide important contributions. Low-cost sensors are also working relatively fine for earthquake localization. Therefore, if you had a chance of installing many new seismic stations, where would you place them and for what other purpose? In major cities exposed to earthquakes, cities typically located near major rivers or oceans on thick layers of sediments, capturing the site effects influence is highly important for understanding why buildings behaved in specific ways or how and where to build better. There are not always enough well-placed sensors inside cities, as this environment poses installation challenges like noise levels or difficult to find free field locations, which are still important even if buildings get instrumented. Boreholes and other methods play an important role in microzonation, but each major earthquake will reflect a more or less distant reality compared to a model. Given that the behavior of buildings kills people and not the earthquake itself, it makes sense to also try to focus installing strong motion sensors in exposed cities. Welcome to Bucharest. This city has experienced major earthquakes in the past, like the ones in 1940 or 1977. Their scars are still visible, but given the still high vulnerability of many buildings, their lessons weren't fully learned or applied. The seismic source responsible for damage in Bucharest is Vrancea, which is, however, located not so close to the city, but at 140-200 kilometers hypocentral distance away. Major earthquakes in this source occur typically at depths between 90 and 150 kilometers and have moment magnitudes up to 8. Unfortunately, due to the depth of these earthquakes, their rupture mechanism but also local site effects, Bucharest can be significantly shaken. But there are also high inter- and intra-event variability in the ground motion. The sole complete accelerogram of the most destructive yet Vrancea earthquake in 1977, recorded at Incerc station in eastern Bucharest, showed a peak ground acceleration value of 0.21 g. Very important is that it also showed high spectral acceleration values at periods of 1.2–1.5 seconds, which partially explains why so many medium and high-rise buildings, 33 in total, had collapsed partially or completely. This accelerogram remains to this day the greatest recorded in Bucharest during an earthquake, and on its basis the design spectrum of the National Seismic Design Code was completely revised. Recordings of the 1986 and 1990 earthquakes at multiple stations in Bucharest, more than 10, showed what has been discussed also after 1977, that the influence of local site conditions leads to significant ground motion variabilities from an area to another, but also from an earthquake to another. This leads to many questions. To which extent is the 1977 recording relevant for all of Bucharest and for all of Vrancea earthquakes at different depths? What could be the impact of different recordings on building design requirements, but also on loss distribution? I, Dragoș Toma-Dănilă from the National Institute of Earth Physics Romania, and my colleagues started an analysis on how to improve the seismic network configuration in Bucharest in order to help researchers and engineers better understand the variability of ground motion parameters, improve rapid earthquake loss estimation, and support the understanding of building damage. An important starting point in the analysis is gathering all useful data layers, enabling an understanding of the seismic monitoring deficiencies and opportunities. For Bucharest, we had the following datasets. Seismic stations in Bucharest which recorded the strong and moderate Vrancea earthquakes in 1977, 1986, 1990, 2004, 2005 and 2009, and earthquakes with magnitudes greater than 4 during the 2011-2020 period. Results of the noise reduction due to the COVID-19 lockdown period analysis on seismic stations in Bucharest. Measurement points for shear wave velocity at 30, 50, 70 and 100 meter depths. Relative depths of the first 7 geological layers under Bucharest in multiple boreholes. The EU Digital Elevation Model version 1.1. The liquefaction map of Bala and Hanic. Distribution of residential buildings in 2011 at neighborhood resolution in different representative typologies. Building damage estimates obtained with SEISMIC for loss scenarios of the 1977 and maximum possible earthquake. Location of buildings evaluated in seismic risk classes individually or urgency categories. Location of buildings significantly affected by previous earthquakes. Corin land cover map. By using multi-criteria decision analysis, a map of locations of more or less importance for research and risk reduction activities can be generated using GIS capabilities. For the first analysis layer, PGA and SA at 1 second values from accelerometers were analyzed in order to reveal in which areas there are high variations in recordings from an event to another, compared to the reference recordings at the Încerc station, one of the most reliable seismic stations in Bucharest with a considerable history. We calculated per earthquake the percentage difference between recordings at each station and at Încerc, and then computed the coefficient of variance per station. A differentiation was made for earthquakes with magnitude greater than 5 and PGA recordings. Coefficients of variations were interpolated through the inverse distance weight method, and reclassification was performed on the results. When high coefficients of variation values were found near a station, the need for a further investigation of the causes was identified. This situation might be generated by problems with seismic equipment and installation, but also interesting local site effects or the influence of earthquakes at different distances and with different magnitudes. When low variability was detected, this should reflect a more conservative location where probably is best to keep seismic stations but also install additional sensors in the area to show if the trend changes or not. This analysis is of course preliminary, and multiple aspects still need to be considered. Regarding the shear wave velocity layer, VS 30, 50, 70 and 100 measurements were used to compute the prediction standard error for Kriging interpolation using the normal score transformation type with usually 8 modifiers for beta distribution and the count of anisotropy in the model. This enabled illustrating where errors in prediction are high, in areas where there is no data, but also in areas where there are conflicting nearby measurements showing either variability, either errors in measurements. Reclassification using quantile classification for 5 intervals was performed, and afterwards weight overlays with equal contributions of the 4 VS layers. The same was done with the borehole data for the first 6 geological layers beneath Bucharest. For calculating the relative depth of the layers, the EU DEM was used. For liquefaction susceptibility, the liquefaction index values were used. The Corin land cover map can help identify potential locations of interest for free field installations, such as parks, which can be much more quiet than the city. Reclassification was performed considering the classifications shown in this map. Data regarding noise level reduction during the COVID-19 lockdown period at specific seismic station was used to highlight areas pretty unstable in terms of noise level, but this index only applies very close to the analyzed stations. The density of buildings individually evaluated in seismic risk classes, urgency categories or sites where buildings were affected during past earthquakes was calculated, accounting also for building height and risk of collapse, and then reclassified as previous using quantile classification. To fill in the picture, data from the census in 2011 was used. Of great interest were considered areas with a high density of pre-code buildings normalized to census tract surface, but also areas with flats built in the low code and moderate code period. A differentiation was made between areas with flats and houses following the approach in Toma-Dănilă and Armaș 2017. Again, reclassification and equal weight overlays were performed. Percentages for severely damaged buildings for two analyzed scenarios were reclassified and weighted following a similar procedure using the SEISMIC data, but the contribution of the maximum possible earthquake scenario was considered double than the one of the 1977 scenario. At the end, multiple reclassified maps resulted, all with values typically in the scale of 1 to 5, with 5 showing a more interesting or suitable location for seismic monitoring. All needed to do for the first demonstration was to perform a final weight overlay of this data. The final proof of concept map is this one. It is clear that more investigation on the links between layers and better justifications for reclassification values and weight overlays need to be defined. But for the moment, I hope that you will find this approach capable also of automatization useful, both for understanding if your seismic stations are placed in locations of interest, but also for future installation plans. Stay tuned for further developments of the methodology. Goodbye!